So, Mom, what's the big surprise? Why are we sitting here like blind Lone Rangers?
Yeah. Why can I still hear you with this mask on?
And here we are back in the saddle looking at lines, waves, and antennas from 4 authors that I've suggested to you were the ultimate, so to speak, gods of the electrical world. Masters of their art. If you haven't seen my previous video, part 1, which starts with the married with children bit, assuming the censors at YouTube don't block it. By the way, YouTube has no authority to enforce copyright law. That's the responsibility and right of a jury. I stated to you, if you haven't seen that video, you got to watch it. If you've seen it, go back and look at what I said at 21 minutes in about this horrible mistake. I'm going to show you the mistake. I'm going to show you how it sets the entire physics book on fire at once. Violates every principle of electrical physics and matter and energy. And this is the source of this fairy tale fantasy about tuners at the feed point, or is a statement of that at least. This is the earliest source I've found, but they just come in this book. They just come right out and say it. But at 21 minutes in the first video, I explained to you that a certain, well, in this book and another paper author, which I go on later to explain in that first video, they say that a mismatch at the antenna causes a mismatch at the receiver. That should set red lights off flashing immediately. So I went past this point in the first video, and if you notice, I kind of stumbled. There's a reason for it. I was trying to find an explanation for you, and I've got it. But to jump right in, how this is relative to amateur radio, read partway down after equation 216. This reflected signal, and reflected signal is an ideal voltage source on the left, voltage. And with ideal sources, if I remember correctly, how's it go? An ideal current source is 0 ohms internal, and an ideal voltage source is infinite, or vice versa. But it's something like that. Look, you can look it up. But the source, the circle, that's an ideal source. It's just, this is such an ultra critical point. It is a source, and source means a source of energy. In physics, energy supplies energy. Energy does work on a load. We heat up a fire, we put a piece of metal in it. The heat does work on the metal. It excites the atoms in the atomic structure. It makes the metal glow, makes it soft, and then the blacksmith puts it on the anvil and can change its shape. The blacksmith can't do anything but go deaf if he beats on that piece of metal without the energy being transferred to it. If you think the fire is metal, then let the fire go out and grab a couple of coals or some handfuls of ashes out of that and go try to build a bridge with it. Ain't happening. The fire is energy. The metal has thermal resistance, and the fire does work on the metal. Same thing here. Voltage source, ideal, it's a fire. The internal resistance of the generator is R sub G, which is a fixed value resistor. And it's literally possible to build this circuit. You won't build a perfect source, but close. On my Rigel generator, wherever it went, I can specify the source voltage and the source resistance separately. Nothing done outside of that changes the setting of that internal resistance. That's a critical point. Ergo, The voltage source is energy, and the resistor, there's a resistor, is mass. But this text goes on to say, the reflected signal, which is energy, travels back toward the generator, and realize the reflection is not because of the resistor. Resistors don't reflect energy. Resistors, by conservation of energy, convert electrical energy into heat. The reflection is what happens with the transmission line. Reflected signal travels back toward the generator, proving it's not a circuit, because if it was a circuit, the change would happen instantly. There's no travel. That word travel invokes the ideas I showed you in the first video of transmission lines being a matter of distance and time. And see the D distance? Circuits don't have that. Travels back toward the generator and is reflected there by the mismatch resistance levels. There's the ham radio myth of reflected energy from a bad antenna being reflected at the transmitter and is eventually radiated. If it was reflected at the transmitter, why would you need a matching network? It's contradictory. Reflected there by the mismatch resistance levels in the same fashion as the load. What that's saying is that the 30 ohm load resistance here somehow changes R sub G. That just torched the entire physics book all at once. Then they go on to say, although the reflection at the source takes place independently of the source voltage, that implies it's a function of the transmission line. I've shown you in my previous videos that's impossible, because the initial condition was that the generator R sub G matches the characteristic of the line. There's no mismatch. How did reflected energy arriving from the load back to the source A change the value of R sub G, which is a resistor with mass? Or how did it change the ratio of the diameters of the left end of that transmission line, which are fixed mechanical values? That would mean that something about that square root of L over C, where L and C are constants, changed, and that violates the laws of physics. Here's a problem with that. They want to play circuits. Let's play circuits. The most basic principle in circuits, Ohm's law, V voltage source, R a fixed physical resistance, and I movement of energy, charges. We call it current. Ohm's law, V equals I times R, and also V divided by I equals R. Ohm's law. V divided by I, notice the arrow, equals R. That's called a mathematical equality. That's a statement of magnitude, quantity, and mass equality. In more advanced equations, those are magnitude. When it becomes AC, the ratios, proportions, frequency, and such of reactive components also takes a frequency or an angle component, so it ends up being magnitude and direction of a vector. V and I represent energy. Energy. Cannot overemphasize this. Boxes around it, exclamation marks, underlines. R is mass. And not the one where they molest choir boys either. There's a resistor. Do not tell me that putting 10 millivolts across that 15 ohm resistor is going to make any change in the value of that resistor. That value will change microscopically because of heating, but that's an effect of the mass and the characteristics of the resistive material. That's a resistor because of resistivity of the material inside. That mass is not created by voltage or current. Saying that a voltage comes back and changes the source resistance violates the most basic principle of Ohm's law. That is a statement that instead of a simple equality equating energy with the effects seen at a resistance, that's a statement that voltage and current make a change in matter. That violates every principle of conservation of mass and energy. And it goes on to violate the principle of superposition. I'll show you that in a minute. V and I are energy. They're related to work, related to power, volts times amps. Volts times amps is watts. Watts are related to joule. Energy per time. Work done is absorbing that energy per time. It's easier to see that in the mechanical world. Power is I squared R. So is R power? Is R energy? No. R is what energy does work on. V divided by I equals R is a statement of equality. The magnitude of voltage divided by the magnitude of the current is equal to the magnitude of resistance, not is resistance. Volts and amps are not resistance. I showed you in a previous video, volts don't even exist. Voltage is a derived quantity. The only thing that really exists is current and the resistivity of the resistor material. V divided by I equals R, not is R. And this is what's happening in this statement in this book when they say reflected energy causes a change in the source impedance or resistance. False. Absolutely false in every way. Volts and amps do not create resistance. It's just a statement of existence. If you're not familiar, go read the concepts of conservation of energy, and mass. Now we'll go on to how this grossly violates the principles of circuits. Basic electrical engineering circuit analysis. Technician hobby level circuits and math. EE 101. The most basic principles. Thevenin, Norton, theories, Kirchhoff voltage law, KVL, superposition of sources. These are the most basic principles of circuits. Unfortunately, this is what bars hands from understanding any of this because they don't study basic circuits. That's why it's so critical to study basic electricity, because everything else hangs on that. But superposition says, basically, that down here with energy source W sub 1 and W sub 2, when they both act on a resistor, assuming they're the same value of source, they don't act on each other. They both act on a resistor. And it's possible to cover one up and analyze the network of the other, and cover that one up and analyze the network on the left. They're both a summation in the center, and in the same way I just explained that a single voltage source does not change the nature of that resistor. If one can't change what that resistor is, the other can't either. Conditions: V sub W1 equals V sub W2. So they're both the same source, there are just two of them. We can imagine that there's a pivot point above the resistor and below it, and we pick up W2 and we swing it over on top of W1. They're the same source. We got the same voltage, now we can source twice the current. So it ends up being that W sub 1 and W sub 2 can be lumped into a single source. So we've got a single source and a single resistor. That's evidence of superposition. V sub W1 divided by R equals I sub W1, basic Ohm's law. Similarly, if V sub W1 is equal to V sub W2, we have an identity. Both sides are identical. That sets up the idea of superposition of sources, or if you will, how one source maps on the other. That's how I think of it. But the important point again is that through the conservation of energy and mass, The resistor doesn't affect the ideal sources, and the ideal sources don't change the resistor in any way. Now, what this statement in this book is saying is that because of the presence of W2, which is the energy coming back from a mismatch load along a transmission line, that somehow that changes that. If you believe that, A, you're drunk. B, you've got some really good stuff. And C, you're not sharing it with the rest of us. That's an allusion to one of the Simpsons episodes where Bart brings booze to school and says, well, I brought enough for everyone. And anybody that believes this, is there's something wrong with them. So these four, probably PhDs, know absolutely nothing about the most basic principles of physics. Is that right? There's no way. These are revered experts. These are I hate to use the analogy, but these are not quite Jesus level authors. Maybe they're Methuselahs. So how did they get to such a screwed up statement that trashes the entire physics book at once? Well, this is what happens when we follow false theories and just theories. Notice in this book there's no proof of anything. In the papers I cited, that author basically copies and pastes this statement, and my guess is he got it from this book. I've never seen this stated anywhere else. But this is a train wreck that occurs when we try to pretend that transmission lines are circuits. And this is exactly like the amateur radio meme, that the same thing happens. It's lifted right out of this book, and somehow, since there's a mismatch, they think they have to use a matching network to fix that, and they totally blank it up. You pick your own expletive. What I'm going to show you is that this is done deliberately. These men could not make this kind of mistake. They left us in here deliberately to trip you up, to show you the result of falsely equating circuits with transmission lines. And this is the summation of what they describe as a almost insolvable problem a couple pages back. Because we can't just jump in the middle of a text here. We have to go back to satisfying boundary conditions for the general lossless line solution. The general solution, blah, 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 is incomplete in the sense that V plus and V minus are unknown. V plus and V minus indicate V along the line. Plus and minus indicate relative direction. And that's in keeping with the magnitude of X as a displacement along the line as part of an infinite line length. They go on to reason, hold on. Writing voltage and current equations as a function of time along the line, which again proves the transmission line is not a lump constant circuit because the line is infinitely long, and there's no such thing as an infinitely long lump constant circuit. You may think of a negative sign associated with reflected current. From the standpoint, blah, 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 sign change on a reflected current permits sum of two waves, blah, blah, blah. Kirchhoff's voltage law, blah, blah, blah. Reflection at a discontinuity at the load. Mismatched antenna, SWR meter says, hey, there's a mismatch. They go on to cite a critical point. What load resistance, not impedance, if any, may be used to terminate a finite length transmission line without reflection, which means is the same thing, same result as an infinite transmission line? The value is exactly the characteristic resistance of the line R sub naught. Since voltage to current ratio everywhere along the line R sub naught is R sub naught for the case of the infinite line, in this situation will not be disturbed if the line is cut at any point and terminated in a resistance R sub naught. The condition is that they both, either the resistor consumes the energy or the infinite line, which will really eventually dissipate it. The infinite line does not allow reflection, but what the point in this chapter is that they can't analyze an infinitely long line Where'd it go? There's no way to analyze that if it goes to infinity. So they've got to put a termination on it. That termination, in order to not upset the line, they terminate transmission line. That's a take your antenna off, put a dummy load on it. That's precisely what that is. Now they go on page 19 to come down to an equation, V function of 0, t equals R sub load I 0, t. This condition cannot be met. The whole thing comes crashing down. By the incident wave alone, since the incident voltage and current are related by the characteristic resistance of a transmission line R sub naught, which brings back the better definition I've told you, is that the characteristic of the transmission line is not resistance. There's no resistor in the line. The characteristic is an external resistance of the same value as a line characteristic, which results in no reflection. And that's what this is saying in more words. To achieve the proper voltage and current relationships of load, we postulate that some of the incident wave is reflected from the load resistance. So now they've gone from an impossible condition to a contradiction where they just said that a perfect termination is R sub naught equals R sub L, but then at the same time there's reflected energy. That's a gross contradiction. The fraction reflected, and this is a theoretical thing, is called the voltage reflection coefficient, and that's what becomes gamma reflection coefficient, and we convert that to SWR. It's just a measure of how much is coming back. There'll now be a voltage wave traveling in the minus x direction, which is reflected, because there's positive x to the right incident, and reflected is minus x to the left. And they go on to find the K sub L, which we see in different sources as gamma, which is R sub L minus R sub naught, R sub L plus R sub naught, and that becomes VSWR. So they've had to go to this fiction of a perfectly terminated line having a reflection, which is impossible, which means that they've had to use the principles of transmission lines to make an infinitesimal change in the load to somehow generate a non-existent reflected energy. But they had to go through this fantasy that violates the laws of physics to come up with a basis to justify the calculation for reflection coefficient, which is real. It really happens. And notice in the paper by Wiener, he states that gamma goes up to 0.9999, not 1. And that's restating this principle. But then once they've totally screwed that up, they can't escape the fact that the line is perfectly symmetrical. The line is identical along its length because of its ratios of mechanical dimensions. Its R sub naught is absolutely the same all the way down the line if it's a perfect line. So since they've stepped in a pile of horse manure here by inventing imaginary energy that's reflected from a perfectly matched load, then because of symmetry and reciprocal properties of the line, you can take that line interval D out and swap it around and nothing changes whatsoever. Not the characteristic, not the length, not the propagation time, not the losses. Then they have no choice but to apply reciprocity by saying that this fictitious change in the load resistance, which violates the laws of physics, also comes back and changes the generator, which also violates laws of physics, and bada boom, bada bing, there we are at the myth of the tuner at the feed point. And again, it pours gasoline on the entire physics book and sets it on fire. But they did this. I do this in my videos. I start off with trying to relate false ham theories and false engineering theories to physics, and ends up in a steaming, burning pile of cow manure with statements like this. And this is where hams and engineers go running off to go put a tuner at the feed point and totally screw things up, because they can't get the simple principle that line is not a circuit, and nothing that is done short of hitting it with a hammer will change that characteristic, and nothing short of burning it up or hitting it with a hammer is going to change that resistor. They are fixed physical, mechanical, chemical quantities, and nothing changes them. Energy cannot create or change resistance. That violates principles of conservation of mass. And energy cannot change the diameters of the center wire of the coax and the diameter of the shield. So what happens with the reflected energy is that it becomes a superimposed source upon node R, top and bottom, and changes the conditions at R. In no case does it change what R is, and no case can it change an ideal source, because the ideal sources are invariant. If the sources are considered, again, if I remember correctly, a perfect current source is an internal short and voltage source is an open. If source W sub 1 is an open, then no potential across R as a result of energy coming back from source 2. No source there can change what W1 is because it's a perfect open circuit. In other words, it is not electrical. It's purely a statement of energy. And energy is not mass, although they can be equated by E equals mc squared. Energy is not equal to mass. They're not the same thing. In the Wiener or Weiner papers, the source on the left is the receiver. It actually becomes a load, not a source. It's the input to the first RF amp in the receiver. In fact, let me draw. Don't you love my cheap videos? RF amplifier input on the left. Transistor, FET, whatever. 50 ohm microvolt microamp levels. A coupling transformer, because the input of the RF amp is probably fairly high resistance or impedance, or is not 50 ohms. Some of the modern microwave amps are 50 ohm input. By the way, they're made inside. But in our radio equipment, that's generally not the case. They're usually discrete transistors. A coupling transformer to transform the resistive values, the antenna jack, the coax cable out to the antenna. What this book is implying and what Wiener's papers are saying, which is false, is that the antenna mismatch, which results in less energy coming down the line towards the left, somehow changes the size, the mass, the number of turns, the M, the coupling coefficient, the position of the tuning slugs, capacitors, the input resistance of that RF amp. It is absolutely false. Energy cannot change the mass or the tuning of that network. And what's happening here, and I have proof of it, is that Wiener is postulating that an increase in received noise is because of a mismatch in the antenna, which results in less signal and noise coming into the RF amp. And the transmission line can't do it, so somehow it's some magical fault inside the receiver, but he doesn't know what it is, can't explain it, and can't prove it. And at that point, the papers of that renowned expert are nothing but toilet paper. Impossible. And if you'll read his papers, he's repeating this statement from that source. That's how we do it in science. We go back and we get sources as authoritative sources or evidence of what has been done before, and we try to continue them forward, but this is a dumpster fire. So what's happening here? All these people have had too much breakfast wine and they've gone nuts and they're making crap up? No. They're not, they didn't, and they aren't. And there's something behind this that propagates deliberate errors. Notice one of the Wiener papers is published by a military source. Governments and militaries live on lies and deception. Notice, published by an Air Force source. vaunted expert publishing a paper on electrically small antennas and noise generated or received in the context of military. You know what an amateur radio fox hunt is? Hide a small low power transmitter, go find it. Piece of cake. Do you know what covert procedures are for hiding a receiver? Well, you make the receiver small, you shield it heavily. You can't drive by, you can't ward drive with a loop and a spectrum analyzer and find it. It's small, low power, heavily shielded, and possibly underground. It can't be found by any RF it emits. The battery's inside the shielded case also. You got nothing but heavily filtered and shielded speaker leads or a data port coming out. You can't find it. This has something to do with certain facilities being underground. But you see, the antenna can't be underground. It's got to be up in the attic. This was a thing back in World War I, World War II. You've seen Hogan's Heroes. They raise the antenna up over the building. They receive and transmit, then they hide the antenna. Well, you can't hide the antenna when it's operating. If the antenna's up there and it's matched, it will light up like a blinking Christmas tree when a transmitter nearby has a transmit antenna that sends out a pulse that resonates with the receive antenna. The receive antenna re-radiates energy. That transmitter shuts off and listens for that return pulse. That's time domain reflectometry. It's like wind coming along and shaking the antenna. And no matter where that antenna is, doesn't matter if you can't see it. It's there physically, and that incident transmit energy will light it up, will be coupled down in the receiver. You can see the antenna. If it's matched to the transmission line, you can't see the line, you can't see the receiver, but you can determine from the responses in the frequency sweep what frequency or frequencies that antenna is on and a probability of what frequencies the receiver is listening to. You want to freak out the experts at your local ham club. Tell them you want to do a fox hunt. You'll go hide a receiver and hide the antenna and dare them to go find it. And they'll freak out because they have no idea where to start. Now you want to hide that receive system. You can't use a matched antenna. You've got to use a mismatched antenna. And if you want to hide it, it has to be small. And there are electrically small antennas. It's going to light up with this instant pulse at some other frequency. It's deceptive. When it's mismatched to the line lights up like a Christmas tree also. When it's matched by a matching network at the feed point, the line becomes invisible. And this is what's behind covert communications. There's a reason these myths and fantasies exist. Like I explained to you in a previous video, when I came across this magical property of a simple SCR, a thyristor in the lab, and another engineer said, "Shut up, that's classified." This is an example of what I've been telling you about. We go along with theory, and all of a sudden, the wagon falls in a hole and busts an axle off. Beyond that point is where this kind of stuff is hiding. And the reason it's not published is because nobody's talking about it. But this, I don't know for a fact that these papers made those false conclusions by accident or on purpose. I don't know the intent of the author. But it is possible to extrapolate beyond that to this. And this is real. Yes, it is possible to go driving around and find receivers. But you'll have to know what you're doing, and the average ham has no prayer of A, understanding it, or B, doing it. So, there's the entire 30,000-foot view and the up-close view of where this extreme, horrifying fantasy of a tuner at the feed point comes from. It comes from this book on page 21. And again, there it is. It's wrong, it's false, it violates laws of physics. The only solution is to get away from this baloney of small antennas and multiband antennas and do it right. Otherwise, you'll have unending problems with noise. I got no noise in any of my antennas. unless I mess up the match. Then they're noisy as everybody else's. I can take my perfectly meshed antennas on the bands they're intended to operate on, and they're basically resistive across the entire band. If I put them on a different band, they're noisy as anybody else's because I know they're mismatched. It's just that simple. So do away with the fantasies. Instead of spending money on a fake tuner, save your money and spend your time learning about and doing something useful with antennas. KBYP did it.